Imagine waking up one morning, living your life as usual, only to be thrust into a nightmare where everything you know and love is suddenly ripped away from you. For one man, this nightmare became a reality. His name was David Matthews, a man whose life was turned upside down in an instant, wrongfully convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. David, a father of two, was known in his small community for his kindness and work ethic. He had no criminal history, no enemies, nothing that could even remotely suggest that he could be capable of such a crime. Yet, despite all evidence pointing to the contrary, the justice system deemed him guilty. A mere mistake, a false accusation, and an ill-timed error turned his life into a series of unforgiving events. The crime he was accused of? A brutal robbery murder that shocked the town. The victim was a respected local business owner, and the entire community was in disbelief. But for David, it wasn't just a crime he was blamed for. It was a loss of freedom, dignity, and trust in the very system that was supposed to protect him. His journey would not only be a fight to clear his name, but also a larger struggle against a flawed justice system that failed him. In this video, we'll break down the shocking truth behind his wrongful conviction, how it happened, how he fought, and what it means for all of us. It was a typical Thursday afternoon when David Matthews' life took a devastating turn. David had just finished his shift at the local mechanic shop and was heading home, eager to spend time with his wife and children. But that evening, the flashing lights of police cars outside his home signaled the beginning of a nightmare. David was arrested for the murder of Thomas Hughes, a well-known businessman in town. The evidence? None. The motive? Completely fabricated. Yet, in the blink of an eye, David found himself in handcuffs, charged with a crime he didn't commit. Witnesses at the scene had reportedly identified him, but David had never even been near the crime scene. He was nowhere close to the alley where Thomas was found. Still, the police insisted on arresting him based on a vague description and what they believed was a match to his car. The arrest itself was chaotic, rushed, and handled with shocking lack of care for the real facts. David's wife, Sarah, begged the officers to double-check the facts, but it was no use. With no solid proof and no time for the truth to come to light, David was taken away. As he sat in the back of the police car, the weight of the world seemed to bear down on him, and he couldn't help but wonder, how did it all go so wrong? David Matthews was not alone in his confusion. Even the police had their doubts, yet they proceeded with the arrest based on a witness's shaky testimony. The witness, a local shopkeeper, had been asked to identify the culprit in a police lineup. The problem? The shopkeeper was half blind and had never actually seen the perpetrator up close. Despite this glaring issue, the witness confidently pointed to David in the lineup, claiming he was a man who had been at the crime scene. The police had made the fatal error of trusting an unreliable identification, one that would later be proven to be a case of mistaken identity. The defense team, when it was finally allowed to intervene, would later reveal that there were several crucial discrepancies in the witness's account. Discrepancies that should have made the entire case fall apart. David was 6 feet tall, while the actual perpetrator was described as being much shorter. The victim had also reportedly seen the assailant from a distance, but there was no way that David could have been that close during the attack. But by the time anyone realized the mistake, David was already behind bars. The damage had been done, and now, an innocent man faced an uphill battle to clear his name, while the real criminal walked free. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of David Matthews officially began. The stakes were high. Prosecutors painted a vivid picture of a cold-blooded killer, a man who planned and executed a brutal crime with no remorse. But for David, sitting in the defendant's chair, this was the moment where the fight for his freedom would begin. David's defense attorney, a quiet yet determined man named Peter Collins, was not going to let the case slide by unnoticed. He asked questions no one else dared to, probing the holes in the prosecution's case. But the prosecution had one thing in their favor: a community desperate for justice. People wanted someone to pay for the death of Thomas Hughes, and David was the only man they could pin it on. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the prosecution was relying on circumstantial evidence that didn't hold up under scrutiny. The alleged fingerprints found at the crime scene didn't match David's, and the DNA samples from the victim didn't link him to the crime. Still, the court seemed to be swept up in the tide of public opinion. David sat numb as the trial unfolded. He had never been in trouble with the law, but now he was forced to sit through a legal process that was about to ruin his life. As the trial continued, David's legal team began to uncover unsettling truths about how law enforcement had mishandled the investigation. Evidence had been deliberately overlooked, and witnesses had been pressured into providing false statements. The police had been desperate to solve the case and pressured nearly everyone they could, witnesses, experts, even forensic scientists, to build a case around David, whether it was true or not. One of the most shocking pieces of information that came to light was that police had withheld critical information. A security camera at a nearby store had captured the actual murder leaving the scene, but the footage had been mysteriously lost, erased, or misfiled by the police. The prosecution didn't seem to care, and neither did the defense team at the time. Even more disturbing was the revelation that the lead detective on the case had a personal vendetta against David. This detective had once had a run-in with David over a minor disagreement years earlier. That seemingly insignificant encounter had turned into an obsession that clouded the detective's judgment. David's lawyer, Peter Collins, fought hard to get this information in front of the judge. But by now, the case was already spiraling, and the law enforcement officers who had botched the investigation continued to avoid accountability. The pressure to maintain the conviction was mounting, and David was left fighting against not just the law, but the people who were supposed to protect him. As the days wore on in the trial, David's legal team became more determined to uncover the truth. While the prosecution had a shaky case, they were pushing forward, relying on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. But David's team was not about to give up. Among the stacks of case files, one particular piece of evidence had been quietly overlooked by both sides. A forensic report had come in late, almost too late. The document was crucial, a DNA test conducted on a glove found near the crime scene. The results were clear, but no one had bothered to look at them thoroughly. When Peter Collins, David's attorney, reviewed the report, he was stunned. The DNA found on the glove didn't match David's. It didn't even match any records in the system. The glove had belonged to someone else entirely, a person who had no connection to David. The lab's error was never disclosed, and the prosecution had kept the evidence in the defense, forcing them to operate with an incomplete picture. But even with this critical evidence in hand, it was still an uphill battle. The system was against David, and now the real question was, could this evidence sway the court's opinion, or would it be too little, too late? The courtroom was tense as David's first hearing took place. This wasn't a full trial, just a preliminary session to determine whether the new evidence would be allowed. David, his wife Sarah, and his lawyer Peter Collins sat in silence as the judge listened intently to the arguments. Peter stood up, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on shaky ground. The identification was faulty, the evidence manipulated, and now we have a forensic report that proves David Matthews is innocent. We ask the court to take this into account and re-examine the case with fresh eyes." On the other side, the prosecution was quick to counter. The prosecutor argued that the evidence could not be trusted and that the timeline didn't match. It was a fight over technicalities, with the prosecution trying to paint the new evidence as irrelevant. As the judge deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. For David, every word, every decision was crucial. His future was hanging in the balance, and the road to exoneration seemed longer than ever. The hearing ended without a resolution, but the judge promised to rule soon. David left the courtroom, unsure what to expect next, but with a glimmer of hope. His fight for justice was just beginning. Behind the scenes, the broken pieces of the justice system were becoming more apparent. The case against David Matthews was filled with red flags, errors made by law enforcement, a biased investigation, and a trial where the facts didn't seem to matter. It was a stark reminder of how easy it was for an innocent person to be caught in the system and discarded. David's story was not unique. It was part of a much larger pattern of wrongful convictions. Cases where people were falsely accused, convicted, and imprisoned based on faulty evidence, coerced confessions, or sheer incompetence. In David's case, The police had been too eager to close the case, and the prosecution was more interested in securing a conviction than in finding the truth. For years, David had been living in the shadow of a broken system, one that failed him and countless others. His story was a call to action, a reminder that the justice system, as it stood, was deeply flawed. David's fight wasn't just for his own freedom. It was for the countless others who had suffered through the same fate. As the trial continued, the prosecution became more aggressive in their efforts to convict David. It was clear they were determined to secure a guilty verdict no matter what. Their case was built on half-truths, assumptions, and the pressure to solve the crime quickly. The prosecutor, a man named Richard Harris, was relentless. He used every trick in the book, including manipulating the emotions of the jury and questioning David's character. "You say you're innocent, but your actions say otherwise," Harris would claim, his voice dripping with disdain. He tried to paint David as a man who was cold, detached, and capable of committing such a heinous act. But David's lawyer, Peter Collins, wasn't intimidated. He fought back with the truth, presenting evidence that directly contradicted the prosecution's claims. Still, the jury seemed swayed by the aggressive tactics. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, with David and his family growing more anxious as the prosecution's strategy seemed to be working. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a battle over facts. It was a battle over perception, and the prosecution was winning the public opinion war. David's freedom was slipping away, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the trial wore on, the cracks in the case against David Matthews became impossible to ignore. The defense had methodically pointed out the flaws in the prosecution's arguments, and yet the court seemed determined to continue down the path of conviction. The judge appeared less interested in the truth and more focused on expediency. Witness after witness was called to stand, and each time, the prosecution's case seemed to weaken. But it didn't matter. The courtroom drama had taken on a life of its own, and the idea of David being innocent was starting to feel like a distant memory. The public was too invested in the idea of guilt to accept the possibility of an error. David's defense team worked tirelessly, but their efforts seemed futile. They found discrepancies in the statements given by the prosecution's witnesses, but the judge dismissed these inconsistencies as minor. The jury was not listening. The trial was spiraling toward a guilty verdict, and David, despite his innocence, had begun to feel like the odds were stacked against him in every way. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable as David sat there, realizing that he may never see freedom again if this trial continued in its current direction. The moment of truth had arrived. After weeks of back-and-forth arguments, the jury deliberated in silence, and all eyes were on the judge as he prepared to announce the verdict. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now held an eerie quiet. David's family sat in the front row, gripping each other's hands, hoping and praying for a miracle. David, sitting at the defendant's table, could barely keep his composure. His heart raced as the judge stood up and read the decision. "We, the jury, find defendant David Matthews guilty of murder in the first degree." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The room spun, and his mind couldn't fully process what had just happened. He was innocent, and yet the court had decided his fate. David's wife, Sarah, gasped, her face pale with shock. His children, seated beside her, had no idea what to do. How could they? Their father, an innocent man, was being sentenced to 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The shockwave of the verdict reverberated through the courtroom. The prosecution, though pleased, tried to hide their smirks, while the defense team's faces fell. They had tried everything, and still, the system had failed them. David was escorted out of the courtroom, handcuffed and shackled. The weight of the false conviction seemed unbearable, but he knew deep down that his fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. David Matthews was now behind bars. His life as he knew it had been completely ripped apart. The small cell, with its concrete walls and steel bars, became his new reality. He was a father, a husband, and an innocent man, but now he was just another inmate in a prison system that didn't care about his innocence. Inside the prison, David faced the harsh realities of life behind bars. The guards, some indifferent and others hostile, treated him like just another criminal, while the other inmates viewed him with suspicion, unable to understand why he was there. David tried to keep his head down, to stay out of trouble, but his mind raced. Every moment felt like a constant battle against despair. For the first time, David began to doubt the very system he had once trusted. He'd always believed that justice would prevail, that the truth would come to light. But now, it seemed that hope was slipping away with every passing day. At night, he would lay awake in his tiny cell, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his family. His children were growing up without him. His wife, Sarah, was left to fend for herself, and there was nothing he could do to change any of it. The weight of his wrongful conviction pressed heavily on him. But deep down, a fire still burned. David knew he wasn't guilty, and he would stop at nothing to prove it. As David settled into life behind bars, his legal team was still working tirelessly to uncover the truth. They had already found several key pieces of evidence that had been conveniently ignored during the trial. Evidence that, if brought to light, could exonerate David and point the finger at the real killer. Among the overlooked evidence was a crucial security camera footage that had been recorded on the night of the murder. The footage showed a figure walking away from the scene, but not David. The man in the video was much shorter, with a completely different build. The prosecution had ignored the footage, claiming it wasn't relevant. But the defense had never been able to present it in court. Then there was the issue of the forensic evidence. DNA samples had been collected from the crime scene, but they didn't match David's. The blood found on the victim's clothing didn't match his either. The prosecution had painted a false narrative, and the truth was slowly starting to emerge. But even with this newfound evidence, David's freedom still seemed out of reach. The system was designed to keep people locked in, especially those who had already been convicted. But David's legal team refused to give up. They would keep fighting, no matter the cost. Outside the prison walls, David's family was struggling to keep their lives together. Sarah Matthews, David's wife, had always been his biggest supporter, but now she was facing a battle she never imagined. Her husband, the love of her life, was in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Their children, still so young, had to grow up without a father. Every day was a reminder of the injustice that had taken David away from them. But Sarah was determined. She visited David every week, bringing him the strength he needed to keep going. She knew he was innocent, and she refused to let anyone forget that. David's children, though still too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, were affected in ways that no child should ever experience. They missed their father's presence, his guidance, and his love. Their lives were forever changed by a decision that had nothing to do with them. Sarah, exhausted but resolute, began to reach out to anyone who would listen. She contacted journalists, legal advocates, and even politicians, all in an effort to get the truth out there. It was a long shot, but Sarah had learned that in the face of injustice, you had to keep fighting, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Life inside the prison was brutal. David was placed in a maximum security facility, a far cry from the quiet life he had once known. The isolation was unbearable, and the constant threat of violence from other inmates was a reality he had to face every day. But the hardest part wasn't the physical abuse. It was the emotional toll. Every day, David struggled with the knowledge that he was serving time for something he didn't do. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. The guards were indifferent at best, cruel at worst, and the other inmates, many of whom were hardened criminals, showed no sympathy for him. Yet, David found a way to survive. He focused on the things that mattered: his family, his fight for justice, and the knowledge that the truth would eventually come to light. He spent his time reading law books, learning the ins and outs of the legal system in the hope that he could find a way out. And then, one day, David received a letter from a group of legal advocates who had taken an interest in his case. They had reviewed the evidence and were convinced that David was innocent. The fight was far from over, but David's hope was rekindled. Maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail. With the letter from the legal advocates came a renewed sense of hope. David Matthews had been incarcerated for years, but now a glimmer of light pierced through the darkness. The legal team, led by an experienced attorney named Grace Warner, had decided to take up David's case. Grace had a reputation for fighting for the wrongfully convicted, and she was determined to uncover the truth. As soon as she began to review the case, Grace found multiple signs of misconduct, tactics that were used to rush to conviction without proper investigation. She contacted David's family and began assembling a new defense strategy. The goal was simple: expose the flaws in the original trial and, more importantly, demonstrate David's innocence. David, locked behind bars, couldn't help but feel a spark of optimism. For the first time in years, someone was fighting for him. Someone believed in his innocence. It was a long road ahead, but with Grace leading the charge, David felt like his fight for freedom was finally on the right track. Grace's team immediately got to work on uncovering the truth. They re-interviewed witnesses, combed through new evidence, and began investigating the police officers who had mishandled the case. David, while waiting for any updates, held on to this one truth: justice, though delayed, was not impossible. While David's legal team worked diligently to uncover the truth, something unexpected happened inside the prison walls. A fellow inmate, someone who had been in the same facility for years, came forward with vital information. His name was Thomas "Tommy" Brooks, a hardened criminal who had overheard conversations about the real murderer during his time on the inside. Tommy had no reason to help David. In fact, most prisoners would have been indifferent to an innocent man's plight. But something about David's case struck a chord with him. He had been wrongly convicted once, years earlier, and he knew what it was like to be trapped in a system that didn't care about the truth. Tommy claimed to have overheard a conversation in the prison yard that revealed critical details about the crime David had been accused of. The man who committed the murder was not only a regular in the neighborhood, but had also been connected to the victim's business dealings, a detail that had been conveniently overlooked by investigators. The information was a game changer. David's defense team scrambled to investigate further. Tommy's testimony could hold the key to proving David's innocence. But there was one major issue. Tommy's testimony would be seen as unreliable by many, given his criminal record. Still, David had no choice. Every piece of evidence was crucial, no matter the source. The fight for justice had just gotten a lot more complicated, but David wasn't about to back down. The case had taken a new turn when David's legal team uncovered a series of legal loopholes that could potentially reopen the investigation. Among the most shocking discoveries was a critical error made by the original prosecutor during the trial. In an attempt to rush the case to conviction, the prosecution had failed to disclose key evidence that could have led to David's exoneration. One piece of evidence in particular stood out: a forensic report that had been dismissed during the trial. The report indicated that the blood found at the crime scene didn't match David's, but rather belonged to a man who was already in prison for a similar crime. The prosecution had ignored this crucial detail, choosing instead to focus on David as the sole suspect. Grace Warner, the lead attorney, immediately filed a motion to have the case reopened. She argued that the original prosecutor's failure to disclose such critical evidence violated David's rights to a fair trial. But the fight wasn't over. The prosecution would certainly try to block this new motion, and the media attention surrounding the case made it even more complicated. Yet, despite the odds, Grace was unwavering. She knew that the only way to right this wrong was through the legal system, no matter how difficult it became. David's hope was slowly rebuilding, as he began to realize that there might still be a path to freedom. The walls of the prison no longer seemed as high. The fight for justice had a new momentum. With new evidence in hand, David's legal team filed an official appeal, requesting that the court reconsider conviction. This was his last chance. If the appeal was denied, David would remain behind bars for the next 16 years. But if the appeal succeeded, it could lead to a new trial, and possibly his freedom. Grace Warner stood before the judge, outlining the key reasons why the case should be reopened. "Your Honor, the evidence against my client, David Matthews, was flawed from the start. We have discovered not only procedural errors, but also evidence that was withheld from the defense. With the new testimony from prison witness Tommy Brooks, as well as forensic evidence linking the real criminal to the scene, it's clear that David Matthews is innocent." The prosecutor, on the other hand, fought to keep the conviction in place. They argued that too much time had passed, and that reopening the case would only serve to prolong the legal process. They painted David as a man who had already been found guilty by a jury of his peers and should be left to serve his sentence. David sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly together. The weight of the last few years had been overwhelming, but now there was a chance. a chance to finally be free. His family, sitting in the back of the courtroom, held their breath as the judge prepared to make his decision. The court was adjourned for the day, and David's fate hung in the balance. Would the judge see through the prosecution's defense and grant the appeal, or would the system once again fail him? Behind the scenes, another force was quietly working to bring attention to David's case. An investigative journalist named Laura Phillips had been following the story from the very beginning. She had spent months researching the case, interviewing witnesses, and compiling evidence. Laura's goal was to expose the flaws in the justice system and raise public awareness of David's wrongful conviction. Through her investigation, Laura uncovered disturbing details about the handling of David's case, details that the public had never heard before. She discovered that several police officers had been involved in a cover-up, ensuring that crucial evidence was either overlooked or destroyed. Additionally, Laura uncovered a pattern of racial profiling in the investigation, where David, a black man, had been unjustly targeted based on his race and background. Laura began writing a detailed expose, hoping to shine a light on the corruption within the justice system and bring pressure to bear on the authorities. She interviewed legal experts, police officers who had been involved in the investigation, and even the victim's family, all of whom agreed that David's conviction had been a miscarriage of justice. As the story gained traction, public outrage grew. People began to question the fairness of the justice system and how many others had been wrongly convicted. Laura's work turned David's case into a symbol for reform, an example of how the system could fail even the most innocent among us. As the appeal continued to unfold, new revelations came to light, shedding light on a disturbing truth. There was more to David's conviction than mere negligence or mistakes made during the investigation. A hidden agenda had been at play from the beginning. The more David's legal team uncovered, the clearer it became that certain individuals within the police force had been involved in covering up the truth. It wasn't just incompetence or oversight. It was deliberate. As Grace Warner dug deeper, she found evidence that the lead detective on David's case had connections to a rival business of the victims, Thomas Hughes. This revelation was shocking. The detective, John Stevens, had been embroiled in a series of shady dealings with the victim over a business dispute that had escalated over the years. Stevens, it seemed, had a vested interest in seeing Thomas Hughes removed from the picture. With a motive in place, it became clear that David had been wrongly accused to divert attention away from Stevens' involvement in the crime. David's family, once again, was rocked by this revelation. How could the system, which was supposed to protect the innocent, allow such a gross miscarriage of justice to take place? And how many more innocent lives have been damaged or destroyed because of the actions of corrupt law enforcement officials? This discovery turned the case on its head. The new evidence was explosive, and David's team knew they had to act quickly before the authorities had time to cover their tracks further. The revelations about Detective Stevens' involvement in the case sparked outrage in the media. News outlets across the country began picking up the story, and soon, David's wrongful conviction became a national topic. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Many were stunned that such a fundamental flaw in the justice system had been allowed to happen. Others were angry at the police for their misconduct and the prosecutor for their aggressive tactics in securing a wrongful conviction. The media's coverage brought even more pressure to bear on the legal system. Protests began to form outside the courthouse as people rallied in support of David. They called for accountability, for the truth to be revealed, and for justice to finally prevail. The outpouring of public support gave David's family renewed hope. They were no longer alone in this fight. For David, the growing public pressure meant that his case was now on the verge of a breakthrough. His story, once confined to a small town, had captured the attention of the world. But with the media spotlight came scrutiny. The prosecution, in an effort to maintain the conviction, began to spin the narrative, trying to discredit the new evidence and paint David as a man trying to manipulate the system. But with every new piece of evidence, David's defenders grew stronger, and the pressure on the authorities intensified. After months of legal battles, the judge finally ruled in favor of reopening the case, granting David a second trial. This was his chance to prove his innocence, and the stakes were higher than ever. With the new evidence, including the crucial forensic report and Tommy Brooks' testimony, David's legal team was determined to expose the truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with anticipation. The prosecution, now under intense public scrutiny, fought fiercely to keep David locked away. They called witnesses, but their testimonies were increasingly inconsistent. The defense, on the other hand, presented a well-organized case, laying out the evidence in a way that left no doubt about David's innocence. The real breakthrough came when Grace Warner presented new forensic evidence. The DNA found at the crime scene no longer matched David. Instead, it belonged to a man already in prison for a similar crime, someone who had been ignored by the original investigators. The courtroom fell silent as the evidence was laid out before the judge. For the first time in years, it felt like David had a real chance at freedom. The judge, clearly stunned by the new evidence, adjourned the trial for the day, promising to deliberate on the case with the seriousness it deserved. David, sitting in the defendant's chair, felt a surge of hope. Could this be the moment his life would finally change? The next day, the courtroom buzzed with energy as the final arguments were made. Grace Warner, confident yet composed, addressed the judge one last time. "Your Honor, we have shown that the prosecution's case against David Matthews was based on a series of flawed assumptions, misleading testimony, and mishandled evidence. The real perpetrator is behind bars, and we ask that you acquit Mr. Matthews of all charges." The prosecutor, trying to salvage what was left of their case, pushed back. "This new evidence is merely a diversion. We have a convicted man, and the public cannot be allowed to undermine the judicial process based on speculation and hearsay." But the defense had a powerful weapon, the truth. With each new fact, the case against David collapsed further. The new forensic evidence was undeniable. The prosecution's witnesses wavered under cross-examination. The public's outcry for justice reached a fever pitch, with even some members of the jury beginning to show signs of doubt. In that dramatic courtroom moment, David's fate hung in the balance. The judge, after a long pause, turned to the jury with the most important question of all. "Has the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that David Matthews is guilty?" The jury's deliberation seemed endless, but when they finally returned, their answer was clear: not guilty. David was free. With the truth finally exposed, the authorities had no choice but to confront the reality of their mistakes. Detective Stevens, the man who had orchestrated the false conviction, was arrested for his role in the cover-up. But the investigation didn't stop there. It was soon revealed that Stevens had been involved in a series of other corrupt activities, including framing other innocent individuals in exchange for bribes and favors. The full extent of Stevens' crime sent shockwaves through the justice system. His actions had ruined countless lives, and David's case was just one of many that had been manipulated. As Stevens was taken into custody, the true criminal behind the murder of Thomas Hughes was finally identified and arrested. Someone with a personal vendetta against a victim that had been ignored during the initial investigation. For David, the moment was bittersweet. He had been exonerated, but the damage done was irreversible. He had lost 20 years of his life, and nothing would bring that time back. Still, as he walked free from the courthouse, he felt a mixture of relief and anger. The system had failed him, but now, at least, the truth was finally out. The courtroom was filled with the tension of finality as the judge read out the decision. After years of relentless legal battles, David Matthews had been declared not guilty. The crowd erupted in applause, some standing in disbelief, others weeping with relief. David sat in his chair, frozen, as the weight of the moment finally hit him. He had been vindicated. The truth had triumphed, but it wasn't without a cost. 20 years of his life had been stolen, years he would never get back. He had missed the birthdays, anniversaries, and milestones of his children. His wife, Sarah, had spent those years waiting for him, fighting alongside him every step of the way. As the judge declared his innocence, David felt a deep sense of gratitude for those who had never stopped believing in him. His family, Grace Warner, the legal team, and even the prison witnesses who had risked everything to expose the truth. But as he looked around the courtroom, he couldn't help but feel a bitter emptiness. The system that had wrongfully convicted him was still in place, still capable of making the same mistakes again. But for now, at least, David was free. His nightmare had ended, but the story wasn't over. There was still much work to be done. David and his family had to rebuild their lives. and the system that had failed him needed to be held accountable. David Matthews walked out of the courthouse that day a free man, but his journey to recovery had only just begun. The world had changed in the 20 years he had spent behind bars, but it was he who had changed the most. His body was older, his mind sharper, but the scars of wrongful imprisonment ran deep. At first, the adjustment of life outside was overwhelming. There were simple things he hadn't done in years. Eating in a restaurant, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, hugging his children. The little moments that most people take for granted were now precious to him. But there was also the overwhelming pain of lost time. How could he ever make up for what he had missed? Sarah, too, had changed. She was strong, more resilient than David had ever known. But their years apart had taken a toll. They had to rebuild their relationship, rediscover the love they had once shared, and forge a new future together. David found solace in spending time with his children, trying to make up for the years he had missed. He worked with lawyers and activists, speaking out about the flaws in the justice system and advocating for reforms. But every time he stood in front of a crowd, telling his story, the pain of the past loomed large. David's exoneration was more than just a personal victory. It sparked a wave of change within the community and across the country. The case had become a symbol of the deep flaws in the criminal justice system, how an innocent man could be imprisoned for so long, based on a broken system that failed to deliver true justice. People rallied behind David, demanding accountability from the authorities and the justice system that had allowed such an injustice to happen. Protesters marched in the streets, and petitions were signed, calling for reforms in police practices, the legal system, and the way wrongful convictions were handled. David's case also shed light on the need for greater transparency and oversight within law enforcement. It wasn't just one corrupt officer. It was a system that had allowed corruption and mistakes to continue unchecked for years. The public outcry grew louder, and soon lawmakers were forced to take notice. For David, the awareness that his case had contributed to a larger cause was bittersweet. While he was grateful that it had brought about change, the fight for justice was far from over. His story was just one of many, and he knew that there were still innocent people behind bars who needed to be freed. In the months following David's release, the public's demand for justice reform grew louder. David and his family became advocates for criminal justice reform, sharing their story at rallies and speaking with lawmakers about the systemic flaws that allowed his case to happen in the first place. David's voice carried weight. He had lived through the horror of being wrongfully imprisoned, and now, as a free man, he was determined to ensure that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. He joined forces with organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform, lobbying for new policies that would prevent wrongful convictions and hold law enforcement accountable for their actions. He spoke out about the dangers of racial profiling, the importance of reliable eyewitness testimony, and the need for proper oversight within the legal system. He didn't want anyone else to go through what he had gone through. The injustice he had experienced should not be allowed to happen again. But despite the changes beginning to take root, David knew that the fight was far from over. The justice system was vast, and it would take years to truly overhaul it. But David had found his purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been wrongfully convicted, for those who didn't have a voice. David Matthews had been through a nightmare, one that no one should ever have to experience. But now, as he stood before a crowd, speaking out against the flaws in the justice system, he realized something important. His story was more than just about his own freedom. It was about the countless others who had been wrongfully convicted, the families torn apart by mistakes made within the system, and the countless victims of a system that prioritized convictions over truth. David knew that no amount of time could ever undo the years he lost, but he also knew that his fight wasn't over. There were still people behind bars, still stories to be told, and still injustices to be righted. His exoneration was just the beginning. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion, and said, "This fight isn't over. I'm free now. But so many others are still trapped in the system. It's time we all stand up for justice, for the innocent, for the wronged, and for those who are still waiting for the truth to come out." The crowd erupted into applause, but David's words carried a deeper meaning. The real fight for justice had only just begun, and David was ready to continue the fight, one step at a time.